Greetings all, this is Professor Theo, and this is a video dealing with intercultural communication in terms of the media's influence on how we see culture. I think this is a very important chapter because oftentimes that which we know about people from other cultures, or one of the main reasons why we develop preconceived notions, positive and negative, and sometimes even develop stereotypes, is because of the media's portrayal of certain people groups. And so when we think about the media, I want you to think about both news media as well as more mainstream outlets such as movies and television shows and music. So in what ways do the things that we hear and the things that we see in terms of media, how does that influence how we see individuals, see people groups, and ultimately how we interact with individuals from those people groups? And so we're going to deal briefly on how the media influences culture. And so you can find this PowerPoint uploaded on Canvas under that particular title. It's going to say Intercultural PowerPoint, ICC PowerPoint, Media and Culture. Alright, so I'm going to get things started. And first off, what we're going to deal with is these two terms, high culture and then popular culture, also known as low culture. So high culture and low culture over time has become synonymous with what we call pop culture. And there's been this age-old debate between these two cultures. High culture would be the quote-unquote culture that is associated with the wealthy and the elite, and or those who may be just middle class financially but aspire to something greater. And these are the type of cultural media-related entertainment that deals with what it means to be respectable and artistic and things of that nature. So think about plays. If you ever went to a play, that would be considered high culture, or a musical, especially back in the days, high culture. To read a novel. So if you're going to read something, you would read a novel. That's high culture. Whereas low culture, you would read a comic book. You know, people see that as like just a waste on your brain, a waste on your mind. That's low culture. Or rap music or rock music back then would have been considered low culture or pop culture music, whereas opera or classical music, Mozart, that would be considered high culture. And if you think about dance, this is often portrayed in movies about dancing. So you think about Step Up to the Streets, all those movies, Save the Last Dance, all those types of movies, even going all the way back to the 80s, before you were probably born. I know before you were born. There was a movie called Breakin', and then there was Breakin' 2. And it was all about a break dancers who eventually linked up with a ballet dancer, and they fell in love like a Romeo and Juliet, and he taught her how to do some break dancing. But whenever she would battle, she would incorporate some of her ballet, and that gave her the leg up on everyone else. And race often plays a part in those movies. It's normally a white female lead in those dance movies who has a high cultural dance background. She does ballet. She does classical dance. But then she gets enamored and falls in love with the streets, or someone from an urban culture who does urban dance or break dance. And she learns how to do that, but whenever she battles, at the end of the battle, if she battles someone who is prolific in that particular urban culture, that urban dance, she pulls out some of her ballet, and that's how she wins the battle. And what those dance movies are portraying, the messages that they're sending, is a very popular message, and that is that high culture is greater than or more important than low culture stuff. It says that, hey, as someone who's schooled in ballet, and I've been doing ballet my whole life, you've been dancing in the streets your whole life. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start dancing in the streets for 1 month. And I'm going to be to learn everything you know about your own dancing because your dancing isn't that hard. It's primitive, it's low level. But you'll never be to learn what I know about ballet. So that always gives that person the advantage. And I believe those messages speak to a greater message about privilege, about sometimes even what it means to be the white male lead or the white lead in the world. That oftentimes those in the majority have the mindset that they can go into minority cultures, learn what it means to be a minority and excel at that. However, minorities can rarely go into the majority culture and excel at that. So it always gives them that advantage. And so there's an age-old debate between high culture and pop culture. And what we often see is that those within the high culture, they secretly want to be a part of the pop culture. So that's why you have more people who are the majority culture dressing a certain way, having dreadlocks, having cornrows, dressing in urban stuff, speaking a certain way. They romanticize those things, although they also speak down upon those things in certain regards. So that's an interesting long-term debate going on. Next, we have three terms that are very interrelated. So the same way high culture and low culture, aka pop culture, are interrelated. You have these three terms: cultural industries, political economy, and then gatekeepers. I just want to adjust this camera a bit. So you have cultural industries, political economy, and gatekeepers. Cultural industries refer to the people who are normally behind the scenes, who's pulling all the strings, who produces the media that often begins to influence the masses in terms of what they see culturally. And so it's important, if we don't recognize anything else, that we recognize that all the media that's put out there that we consume, it's rarely just for leisure. Even if the movie comes across as being, it's just an action movie, it's just a comedy. No, someone is having to greenlight that media. Someone's having to sign off on that, and there's always an agenda. There's always a strategy behind the stuff that we see on TV, the stuff we see in the movies, the stuff we hear in in terms of music. Now, because of social media, you have more individuals who can take ownership, who can put out their own product and bypass some of these higher up media companies. But if you're talking about what comes out in the theater, if you're talking about what's going to play normally on the radio, the things like that, there's still these cultural industries who control that, who produce that. And money is normally one of the main reasons behind what they produce, but also power, the power to influence, the power to control the narrative, the power to always be able to direct what the people think. That's also behind those cultural industries. And so whenever you see a movie that involves race, unless it's supposed to be a historical account, because if it's a pretty accurate historical account, we can trust that is what it is. If there's a historical movie about classism or sexism or racism, if it's pretty accurate, we could say, well, that was a reality. But say if it has fictitiousness in it, all set now, who determines what's embellished? Who determines what's real and what's not real? And why did they make that determination? It's often because there's an agenda to continue to put forth a certain narrative about certain groups, about women, about men, about blacks and whites and Latinos and Hispanics. There's normally an agenda, even if sometimes it's conscious and malicious and strategic, sometimes it's unconscious. We put out material and media based upon our preconceived notions of those particular people groups. And we have a tendency to make our people group, whether if it's a man putting out stuff about men, we're going to make the men look good. If it's someone white putting out something about white, they're going to make the white people look good. if there's something about the rich versus we always have those subconscious biases that can rear their ugly heads in terms of the media that we put out there and in terms of the media that we consume. Because we normally consume the type of media that's going to affirm who we are and the media that makes us feel good about ourselves. And so cultural industries are those who are behind the scenes, pulling the strings, who are controlling what's being produced. Now, the power that the cultural industries hold, that's called the political economy. So when we normally think about economy, we think about wealth in terms of currency. How well is the economy doing? You know, the stocks and then also the flow of cash. Well, in terms of media, in terms of that, the economy is the power held by the cultural industries in terms of how to relegate what's put out there, when it's put out there, how long it stays out there, all those things. And then once again, normally behind the scenes, the driving force is capital, money, power, the ability to hold on to one's position in authority. So if you were the person in charge, you wouldn't allow a mass flow of media that calls into question your authority. You would not allow movies to be made that paint you and others like you in a negative light. Now, for some balance sake, you may allow a few of those type of movies and television shows, but you wouldn't allow the majority of those things. After a while, you would think that the mass consumers would begin to see those movies and those television shows and hear that music and begin to question you. So normally you're going to use your political economy to make sure that the movies and the television shows and the images being portrayed in the mainstream media as well as news outlets paint you in a positive light, that they allow the status quo to remain. And so you have these cultural industries, those are the power brokers, and the power that they have is known as the political economy. And closely related to that are the gatekeepers. And gatekeepers are a more generic term of anyone who has the ability to control the flow of the information, to control the flow of the media. So now this may not necessarily be the one who produced it, the person at the top or the group of the people at the top, but maybe even think about your local news outlets. Or even think about at Bethel College, the PR department. They control if something bad happens on the campus and everyone knows what's going on, well, they just don't say, hey, this bad thing happens, especially if it's kind of scandalous, if it may paint the college in a bad light. Most institutions have a PR branch where they disseminate the message. They clean it up and they put out the memo and they try to make it as nice as possible and to try to minimize the damage. So in regards, they would be gatekeepers. So anyone who has the ability to control the flow of the information to say this can come through and this can't come through, or when it comes through, those are gatekeepers. And oftentimes the job of the gatekeeper isn't to arbitrarily say, well, the truth can always flow. All messages can always flow. No, once again, because there's money to be made and there's money to be lost and there's reputations to be made and reputations to be lost and power and shifting, gatekeepers have the job that they often can't just go based upon what they personally think, what they would desire to see. They have to oftentimes keep in mind the institutions or the power brokers that they work for. What do they want to see come and go? What information do they want to see freely flow and not flow? And gatekeepers often have to find a balance between what their personal beliefs are and maybe what are the beliefs of the institutions that they work for. Hopefully they line up, but sometimes they don't line up and they find themselves being conflicted because now they have to allow information that go through that they normally wouldn't endorse, and they may have to suppress some truth and some information that they would want to see get out there. One moment, please. So you have those cultural industries who are the power brokers. You have the political economy, which is the power that they have. And then you have these gatekeepers who oftentimes work for the cultural industries, and their job is to control the flow of the information. Now we have three new terms. Hegemony, depends on how you pronounce it, hegemony, or hegemony, or hegemony. I don't care how you pronounce it, really. And I'm not sure the exact pronunciation. So we're just going to call it hegemony. This is a process in which those who produce the media try to get the consumer to have a consensus or to consent to or accept certain ideas, certain ideologies, certain people groups. And by default, they would then begin to reject or minimize any conflicting ideas or any contrary people groups in order to really elevate this one people group. And so think about all movies that have heroes and villains. Every movie that has a hero and villain, those people who produce the movies want you to have a consensus that this is the good guy, or this is the good person. This is the hero. And they get to determine what a hero does, what it means to be a hero. And by default, there's going to be a villain who, by the end of the movie, you should not like. You should not agree with their ideologies. And sometimes it's clear cut. The person is clearly said that this is the hero, especially in superhero movies, and this is the villain. But what about in movies that's more realistic, real life movies, where they don't say clear cut, this is the hero, this is the villain. Instead, what they do is they make this person likable. This person gets praise and props for what they do, and this person gets marginalized and minimized and even villainized for what they do. And oftentimes it has cultural implications. You know, in movies where the male is the power broker, he's often seen as a hero. Whereas maybe the female counterpart is marginalized and minimized. Or maybe they do it in terms of race. Or maybe they do it in terms of economic, the wealthy in the movies versus the poor people. And the hopes is, and like I said, it's not always malicious, but it is intentional, is that you begin to see one ideology, one people group in a certain positive light, that you would accept this ideology. And by default, you would reject other ideologies. So think about all the movies like Hunger Games, and there was another movie that was kind of like the Hunger Games. I can't, what was it called? It had another white female lead, and there was three of them also. Insurgent, was it Insurgent? Might have been called Insurgent. And there were some spin-offs of that. And the whole idea of these movies are that there was almost like a class system. You had these rich, wealthy elite who were behind the scenes pulling the strings, like in the Capitol, and they pitted the poorer classes against each other. And it tried to portray this ideology and that rich, wealthy power is the way to go, and that those who are poor should have to fend for themselves, should have to be pitted against each other, and survival of the fittest type thing. Well, we can watch those movies and we see them as pure entertainment, but once again, nothing is just pure entertainment. The messages that it's sending, because it's like that in real life, that there are rich, wealthy billionaires who are making all the decisions that normally influence those who don't have that type of money. And so, and it keeps the wealthy wealthy and keeps the poor. In fact, it eventually makes the gap get larger and larger. And not only that, but you can't have people groups, and you're going to learn more about this when you take me in comm theory. This is one of the things that Marx and Marxism really talked about, is whenever you have these different classes of people, in order to control those classes of people and to keep that class structure going, oftentimes the power brokers, those who are in power, employ the use of media to put out messages that keep the people in place. And you see this all throughout the history. Whenever you have wars going on, whenever you have class wars or cultural wars going on, there has to be the type of propaganda that goes out that makes those who are oppressed continue to stay oppressed. The messages have to be that your oppression is because you earned it, or it's God's way of doing things. And if he wanted you to be wealthy, he'd have made you wealthy. So there has to be these messages that bombard us to keep us divided. And so oftentimes this hegemony puts out this media that keeps us divided, because you adapt one ideology at the expense of another, or you elevate one cultural group at the expense of another.